everybody remembers to come on Wednesday. This is great. And you got a busy week, so you got Pink Martini tomorrow, which I'm sure many of you are going to. I was struggling to figure out what to cover tonight because there's a bunch of things I want to talk about because our state flower is blooming right now. Hopefully you're seeing the jessamine around. I did a trip on Monday to Jekyll Island with Matt Turnbull and with Jay Gratton. We went to meet their conservation staff and talk about what they do. Jekyll Island is 5,000 acres. Spring Island is 3,000. They get 3.3 million visitors per year. So they have very different challenges than we do. But that was a productive visit. I'll have to share more about that another time. A different thing propelled into my list today. Today was Master Naturalist at Nemours Wildlife Foundation, and we had a great day out there. It was really blustery and windy, which it wasn't here. It's not that far away.
Yeah.
But they were doing a prescribed fire, and their pine forest was right next to a big wide open field, and the wind was whipping through, and they had a really productive burn. As you would hope it would. And then I came back here and ran into Chris Newton, who looked like he needed some electrolytes, because he and his team had to work really hard for their prescribed fire today. The wind was not as strong here, less than the forecast was, and also the humidity was higher than the forecast. So that made it for a challenge. If you step back and you think, we're going to burn hundreds of acres in a winter, that seems like you've got months of opportunity. But then when you look at the days that have enough wind, but not too much, and the humidity is low, but not dangerously low, and it's not a Saturday or Sunday because the support staff for all of this might not be available, and it can't be during member guests, and it can't be during certain things, like our window shrinks down and down. And so today was like suboptimal, but they still did a little over 100 acres today. So you have a homework assignment, which is to go walk Osprey Woods and the duck ponds. And Osprey Woods is really blackened out from the burn. And I want you to take pictures, and I want you to walk it again in a month and see what it looks like a month later, because it'll come right back. It also lets you see that it's a mosaic. It burns well, and then it hits spots that don't burn. And the really cool thing is if you look down at your feet, you will see spots that didn't burn, and there'll be a little pile of oak leaves right there. Those oak leaves put out the fire right where they're lying, even though they're surrounded by pine needles. It's really cool to see. So if you just walk through really any section of Osprey Woods, but I'd say the south end of it is kind of the best part to see all of this. It's really memorable. Because of the weather conditions, with less wind than expected, there is more smoke than expected. So you're going to notice the smoke, and it should clear out in the morning. And then the other thing is, when we have a burn that has a mosaic, occasionally a tree reignites at night. And if that happens, it's fine. If the tree is in the middle of an area that burns, that tree is going to burn, and it's going to fall over, and that's the end of the story. But if you are concerned, you can reach out. You can reach out to security. Security knows what to look for. If the tree is next to a trail and it's going to fall over to an area that's not burned, that's a problem and we need to know about it. But if you got any concerns, please reach out. We want to do our best to monitor and manage all of that. All right, more prescribed fires to come. I'll talk about them again, I'm sure. All right, so tonight we have a speaker who's also a published author, and hopefully you notice there's a stack of books over there. Madeline, who is over here. I don't know if everybody's met Madeline Cox yet. She's our communications and engagement specialist that started in December. Madeline will be happy to put a book on your account. So you just got to go over. She doesn't know all your names, and you might not have known hers, so please reintroduce yourself to her, and she'll take your name down, and our speaker has agreed to sign books as well afterwards. So you already signed mine. All right, so our speaker tonight is historian Ben Parten. He's an assistant professor at Georgia Southern University. He's also a distinguished lecturer with the Association of American Historians. He's originally from Royston, Georgia, and now lives in Savannah. He has a PhD in history from Yale University, and his writings have appeared in the Washington Post, Los Angeles Review of Books, Zocalo Public Square, Civil War Monitor, and many others. And it's my pleasure to turn it over to Ben Parten.
Okay, good evening.
Good evening.
Everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, let me start just by saying thank you. And first, I want to thank Andy for that very generous, very nice introduction. But I also want to say thank you to you all for being here and also for inviting me to come out. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here. You know, sometimes I get asked, what's the best thing about having written a book? And the answer is, well, finishing it, not doing it anymore. But the other answer is just simply doing events like this where I get to talk to folks, meet people, share stories. So looking forward to chatting with more folks later on, and again, just really appreciate the invitation to come over here and speak. And so what I want to do tonight is leave time for Q&A. I'm happy to answer any kind of questions folks might have. But I do want to talk a little bit about the book. And what I tell people whenever I speak to groups like this is that maybe the best place to start is just by saying a little bit about where this book began for me. And the reality is there's kind of two stories. There's what I think of as the long story, the longer story, and then there's the much shorter story. And the longer story just has to do with the fact that I was born and raised in Royston, Georgia, which is about 20 miles north of Athens. And once, twice, 3 times, maybe 4 times, if my dad and brother went to the Georgia-Florida game in Jacksonville, my family would pack up everything, we'd drive down here to the coast, we would go to St. Simon's, Jekyll, Hilton Head, most often we went to Fripp Island, which is not too far. And what is so interesting about that is that for that entire trip, except for all of maybe the first 30 minutes, you were essentially traveling on one of the routes that Sherman's army took to Savannah. And then coincidentally, that's now a route that I take to go visit my family now, since I live in Savannah. And then the other route, when I go see my in-laws in Atlanta, is the other route that Sherman's army took, essentially 16 to 75 to Atlanta. So it's a little hard to escape. And then when my family would come down here to the coast, to Fripp, to Jekyll, St. Simon's, wherever, as much as I enjoyed fishing or playing golf with my dad and my brother, what I really enjoyed doing most was just driving around. I mean, you guys are here in Spring Island, you've seen, you know the scenery. I love to just drive around and explore the low country. And so when I was off in graduate school in snowy New Haven, Connecticut, feeling very homesick, and it came time for me to do a PhD dissertation, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I wasn't really all that certain that I wanted to do something on the Civil War at all. But at the end of the day, it just made a lot of sense for me to, well, write about what I know, which is just Georgia, the low country, and of course, Georgia's biggest, most important historical moment, which is, of course, the Civil War. And here I've got to give a lot of credit to my PhD advisor, who always sort of nudged me along and said, no, you shouldn't do that other project, do this project. You're a Georgia boy, you're from there, it'll mean a lot to you, and people will really appreciate it, so you should definitely do this project. So I got to give a lot of credit to my mentor for that. And so I'd like to think that this book really began just for my own background, right? My own biography. Just my own memories of growing up where I did and coming down here as many times as we did as a kid. And so that's a bit of the longer story of how this book began. But the shorter story actually has a lot to do with me reading a work of fiction. Do we have any E.L. Doctorow fans in the audience? People familiar with E.L. Doctorow? Yeah, Doctorow's great. He gets pigeonholed sometimes as a historical fiction writer, but I think he's one of our best writers, bar none. And he is best known for a book called Ragtime, which is a great book about America at the turn of the 20th century. It's primarily set in New York. But Doctorow also tried his hand at writing about Sherman's March in a book he called simply The March. And as was Dr. O's characteristic style, and if you've read The March or you've read Ragtime, you know this is true, he wrote with a truly wide cast of characters. I mean, there are too many to even count and name. In his book on the March, Sherman appears as a character. There is a German-born U.S. Army surgeon. There's a white Southern debutante who becomes the surgeon's love interest, and it gets really weird. There are two Confederate prisoners of war who change sides to get better treatment, and they change sides again, and then they become the tragically comic characters in the story. But Dr. O also included as one of his characters a free woman by the name of Wilma Jones, who, as her world is changing and as the army is marching through Georgia, she decides to drop everything, flee to the army, and then follow the army all the way to Savannah. And you later find out that she is likely the mother, if not the grandmother, of a really important character in Ragtime. But I won't say anything else to spoil anything. But nonetheless, it occurred to me, not only was I struck by her story, but it occurred to me that there's no way that Wilma Jones could have been a singular character. That she had to have been a composite character. There was likely hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of people just like her. People who, as the army was marching through Georgia, dropped everything, ran to the army, and then fled behind the army to Savannah. And so this book really began with just a simple question of, well, can we tell the story of Wilma Jones and people just like her, not as historical fiction the way that Dr. O did, but as real history, right? Can we find the sources and tell this as a real bona fide work of history? And so it's that question, that goal or that mission, that gave rise and really birthed this book for me. And in many respects, all along, I thought that my goal was simply to write the nonfiction handbook to Dr. O's The March. And so we fast forward now, my book, Somewhere Toward Freedom, Sherman's March and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation, tries to do exactly that, right? It's a history of emancipation in the wake of Sherman's march through Georgia in the last full year of the Civil War. And I should say that I was ultimately able to tell this story, to write this story, because when Sherman arrives outside of Savannah, he speculates that maybe as many as 20,000 freed refugees from slavery had followed his army and arrived with his army in Savannah. That's 20,000 Wilma Joneses, 20,000 people who had dropped everything, run to the army, and then follow the army to Savannah. And I just want to take a quick second to appreciate just how big 20,000 people is, right? For comparisons, that's a third of Sherman's overall army. That's double the size of Atlanta in 1860. And that is roughly the size of Savannah in 1860, which was not only Georgia's largest city, but one of the largest cities in the South. So this is a massive, massive movement of people through the state of Georgia in the war. And so what my book does that's new or different or novel is that it tries to tell the story of Sherman's march through the perspective of the refugees, through those 20,000 people who followed the army to Savannah. It tries to put their experiences right at the center of the story. Now, I don't think I need to tell too many people this, but this is not traditionally how the story of Sherman's march has been told. Instead, for most of the 20th century, historians have been debating whether or not Sherman's tactics in Georgia previewed what people like to call total war, meaning, did what Sherman do here in Georgia preview what's going to come later on the farms and fields of Western Europe in the First and Second World War, Vietnam, some of these more modern conflicts? And the answer is not really, but kind of. It's really complicated. It's something we can definitely talk about in Q&A if we want to. But even so, if you've seen Gone with the Wind, you know the central scene of that film is the scene of Atlanta all ablaze. And if you live in Georgia long enough, as I have, right, you still hear people talking about him as a sort of Genghis Khan character. In fact, someone just showed me a sign of a billboard here, I think it's in Richland, right, that basically makes the same accusation, right? So this idea is still around. But the larger point is that because of that, we've always imagined this moment, this historical episode, as being a purely military event, right? We focused on the fire and the guns, we focused on the army, we focused on what Sherman did in Georgia. But the point that I try to make in the book is that for enslaved people, yes, this was a military event, almost by definition, but for enslaved people, it was always much more than that. For enslaved people, this moment was a true liberation event. It was a true freedom movement. And we can think about this in a couple different ways. I mean, on the one hand, this is a campaign that ultimately destroys the Confederacy. It's a campaign that will destroy slavery in Georgia and South Carolina and strike a real blow at slavery overall. It's a campaign in which at least 20,000 people followed Sherman's army to try to make freedom mean something on the way here to the coast. And it's a campaign in which some untold number of people experienced freedom just as a consequence of this movement. And this, in a sense, is where the subtitle comes from. Because that 20,000 number, as big as it is, it doesn't take into account the people who might have run to the army and then were turned away by the army, which we know happened. It did happen, especially the closer it got to Savannah. Doesn't take into account the people who might have made half the journey and then turned back somewhere along the way. And again, it doesn't take into account the tens of thousands of people who simply experienced freedom as a consequence of this moment. And so what happens is when you take all these different factors combined, what you get here, well, I say here in Georgia, I live in Savannah, is the largest emancipation event in American history. It is an event, a moment, that does, in reality and on the ground, in effect, what Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation could only ever have done on paper. So this is a real freedom movement, a real moment of liberation for enslaved people. On the other hand, the reality is that this movement of 20,000 plus people through Georgia, along with 60,000 of Sherman's army, is going to be such a large movement that it'll go on to have real consequences for what Reconstruction looks like. The America that is created by the Civil War will be in part an America that is impacted by the aftermath of this movement. And we can think about this through things like the Freedmen's Bureau, which is the U.S. government's central agency created to facilitate the transition from slavery to freedom. We can think about this through the fate and future of land reform on the southern coastline. And we can even think about just the meaning of freedom itself, right? All of these things will have plot points and storylines that point back to, if not Sherman's march, to at least the aftermath of this massive movement of people through Georgia. And so, we always imagine Sherman's march as being one of the last campaigns of the Civil War, but I think maybe a better way to think of it as one of the first battles of Reconstruction. One of the first kind of crucibles for determining what a post-Civil War America might look like. And it's this point that strikes at one of the larger arguments that I try to make in the book, which is that yes, Sherman's march was a military event, again, almost by definition, of course it was that. But I think maybe the better way to think about it or understand it is to think of it as a landmark moment in the making of American freedom, however we might want to define that. Yes, we can place it alongside moments in the Civil War like Shiloh or Vicksburg or these, any of these other campaigns or battles. But I think the better conversation to put it in is alongside a moment like Lincoln at Gettysburg, like Yorktown, like Philadelphia in 1776, like Selma, Alabama in 1965. Right, one of these touchstone moments in the history making of American freedom. And so that is ultimately what I try to do in the book, is try to present Sherman's march in such a way that we see it alongside these types of events and see it as a turning point in the history of American freedom. So that's a big picture case for the book. It's a big picture pitch for what I try to do in the book and some of its arguments. But what I want to do now is take a quick step back and talk a little bit about just what this movement would have looked like on the ground, and go into a little bit more detail about this movement. And I want to start by saying just a little bit about the history of the Civil War. And I want to start by pointing out that one of the premises we have to understand about the Civil War is that from the moment it began, even after it ends, I should say, enslaved people never stopped running to the army. From the beginning of the war, right up until the end, and even after the war is officially over, enslaved people always move to try to get to the army and meet the army. They do this consistently and constantly throughout the war. So much so that historians speculate that maybe as many as 500,000 people to 600,000 people attained freedom or something like it in this process. And the term that historians use to describe enslaved people who attained freedom in this way is refugees. And they do that because one of the things historians have discovered is that wherever the army was, and wherever the army set up camp, usually large numbers of enslaved people who had run to the army set up auxiliary camps right beside where the army was. And they do that to avail themselves of its protection, of being close to men with guns, right, and cannons. And they do that too because for many of them they find work, working for the army. They do the grunt work that an army needs to be successful, right? Burying the dead, leading the trees. Women served as cooks and laundresses. But these camps look and would have been like kind of modern refugee camps, right? Tent cities. They look like refugees, or refugee camps. But also for enslaved people, right? The experience of freedom like this is as a kind of modern refugee experience. There's nothing in the way of citizenship. There's no asylum, right? It's an experience of deep uncertainty and insecurity. And so historians have adopted this term of refugees because I think it makes a lot of sense. And in fact, this is an image showing what enslaved people would have looked like, right? Trying to get to the army. This is an image from Virginia. It's an approximation of what would have happened in Georgia. But Georgia becomes such a large phenomenon, and that so many refugees run to the army, in part because of a different coalescence of factors. And a lot of it has to do with timing. Sherman's march comes in late 1864. The Emancipation Proclamation is well over a year and a half old by this point. Georgia has a large population of enslaved people. And people don't know it just yet, but there's an assumption that this could be it. This could be one of the final campaigns of the war. And so enslaved people know that they can just get to the army, they can find freedom or something like it. And slavery is in its death throes. That's the assumption, and that is in part what sets up Sherman's march to be this large phenomenon. Now, just for context, the march itself begins in mid-November 1864. In the east, Lee's army is essentially besieged by Grant's Petersburg, and the march itself comes after the Battle of Atlanta, which was a major, major victory for Sherman's army for a variety of different reasons that we can talk about later if you like. All you really need to know is that the march itself is the campaign that comes next. It's a march of about 250 miles, includes some 60,000, maybe 62,000 soldiers, and it lasts about a month and a half, maybe 2 months, depending on how we want to define a start or finish. Except, and I'm sure this is something that many of you know, this was not your ordinary military campaign. Part of Sherman's strategy in leaving Atlanta was he knew he had to leave his supply lines behind. So he instructed his men to forage off the farms and fields of middle and central Georgia, both to sustain themselves, because they needed it to survive, to feed themselves, but also because he was very clear that he wanted to target the emotional and psychological and material wherewithal of white Southerners to continue keeping up the fight. And Sherman is very clear about this. And this is something I should say is not really that much of a surprise coming from him. This is a strategy that is in some respects born out of Sherman's own personality. If you've read anything about Sherman, you know what I mean. But also because he had long been a kind of canary in the coal mine. When people early in the war were expecting this to be a short war, when people were expecting this to be a war where maybe one battle, one summer, and things would be over, Sherman says, no way. He's writing back to people who would listen saying, no, we need to prepare for a much larger conflict, much more violent conflict. And he's doing this very, very early on. But he also comes to this strategy because he had the experience of trying to govern the city of Memphis in 1862. And Memphis was a completely unrepentant Confederate town. And when he was there, he was faced with the challenge of dealing with Confederate guerrillas. These were non-uniformed partisans who would sneak into the city, fire off pot shots at his men. And he had a particular challenge of dealing with folks who would fire on ships coming up and down the Mississippi River. And so Sherman's strategy for dealing with this problem was to march soldiers out to the villages that harbored these guerrillas, and essentially burn the villages. And he would give them instructions to leave one structure standing, just so they knew where to mark it on a map after the fact. He then began expelling white families from Memphis for every shot fired on any of his men, which is something he would do again in Atlanta. And so again, that Sherman would take this strategy is not really a surprise. This is something that's a long time coming from him. It's very much in line with his thinking. At the same time, Sherman always encouraged his men, or instructed his men, I should say, to forage by the book. There was a method to the madness. What does this mean? Well, it meant only taking as much as maybe 10 days worth of food. He always instructed that only officers were allowed to requisition large livestock like horses, cows, pigs, what have you, on the assumption they would be more judicious than just common soldiers. And he also instructed his men that they were never to set fire to anything except for cotton houses and cotton storehouses, cotton barns. So one of the images we have of this moment is that all these structures and buildings ablaze, but in most cases it's not houses so much as barns, anything that supports the cotton economy. He even instructed that his men were supposed to be, or show restraint in the case of the poor, who he believed had already given up the fight and who he believed could ill afford to lose valuable goods and supplies and livestock. And then he urged his men to show much less restraint in the case of the rich, who he believed were still keeping up the fight and who could very much afford to lose a horse or a pig or a cow or two. And so Sherman, wasn't quite the Genghis Khan character that he is sometimes made out to be, right? There was a real method to his madness. But at the same time, this is an active war zone. Things certainly got out of hand. And Sherman also gave his men license to wreak what he called a commensurate form of vengeance should anyone get fired upon. Should any of the families he came to, any of the plantations he came to, resist his foragers. But what's often lost in this story, the story that sometimes gets missed, is that from the moment Sherman's army left Atlanta, enslaved people began running to meet his army. In the towns and cities right outside of Atlanta, there were so many enslaved people lining up on roadsides, so many horses, military flags, military bands, people in uniform marching, that everything felt like a kind of emancipatory parade. And certainly enslaved people welcomed the army as such, or as if that is what was actually going on. But when we venture out into the farms and fields of middle and central Georgia, things there are much more complicated. Things there are much more violent. And there, enslaved people often acted as third-party brokers in this standoff between Sherman's foragers, Sherman's soldiers, and white Southern families. And in many cases, they act as third-party brokers in their own freedom, their own emancipation. They would talk to Sherman's men. And one of the things that becomes very clear is that for the Army, they recognized very early on that enslaved people were their best allies. They were their best friends. That wherever they needed help, enslaved people were almost always willing to help. Enslaved people through Georgia, they did a number of things that proved to be of immeasurable importance to the Army. Sherman specifically asked for enslaved people to get a lay of the land, to act as intelligence scouts. Enslaved people pointed directions down hidden paths in the woods. They let the Army know where Confederate cavalry had been seen. They did a number of really important things to ensure the Army's success. And again, this is something that the soldiers recognized and appreciated. And maybe the best example that demonstrates this is what happens when Sherman's foragers arrived on these plantations. Because what would happen in Georgia and throughout the Civil War is wherever Sherman's army went, or any U.S. army for that matter went, usually white Southern families hid their valuables. They would bury in an empty plot in the cemetery all their things in a trunk and place it somewhere in the cemetery. They would take all of their livestock, all their horses, all their cows, you name it, to some corral hidden out in the woods. But of course, I say they didn't actually do it. They forced enslaved people to do it for them. So what this meant was when Sherman's army arrived in these places, enslaved people were typically, more than willing to say, yeah, everything's buried right there, right? Or say, if you just follow me, I'll take you to where you can find, 50 horses, whatever you need. And in some instances, they even bartered with the soldiers. And they would say, I'll take you to these things, I'll show you these things, but you've got to take me along. You've got to take my family along. And so they would negotiate with the men because of this knowledge. Another great example of just how crucial enslaved people were to the Army's operations is a story having to do with when the Army, at least its left wing, arrived just north of Savannah. Here, the plantations and the farms were less abundant. Many of them had been picked over. The roads had been disturbed. And so for the first time, the campaign really slowed to a crawl. There were real worries that maybe the foragers might return empty-handed, maybe they would go hungry, and maybe this grand campaign just might not be as successful as everyone thought. And so there was real fears that maybe some of Sherman's men might run out of their forage and go hungry. And they might have gone hungry, except for the fact that these are rice plantations, former rice plantations. And Georgia's enslaved people kept them fed by teaching them how to eat rice. Sherman's men were all Midwesterners. They were from Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Wisconsin, not necessarily the rice coast. They certainly, if they had rice, they'd never, knew how to cook it with beans, right? Or how to use a mortar and pestle to actually prepare it. But they didn't have to because Georgia's enslaved people taught them how to eat it, how to prepare it, and they cooked it for them, and they kept them fed. In these critical few days right before Atlanta Falls, when this campaign could go either way, Georgia's enslaved people ensured that they're fed and sustained. Another great example about just how crucial enslaved people were to the overall operations of the Army has to do with a group of people known as the pioneers, the military pioneers. And in most other instances throughout the Civil War, to be a military pioneer was to do the kind of grunt manual labor that is necessary in Army camp. As I said before, dig latrines, bury the dead, drag wagons, whatever. But in Sherman's March, to be a pioneer was to essentially be a road builder. These were people who went out in front of the Army as it was marching and prepared the roads. Wherever there was any sort of embankment that had been disturbed, wherever there was too much mud, they essentially cleared the way and paved the way for the Army to march. And it just so happens that in Georgia, the pioneers were made up almost exclusively of formerly enslaved people, free people who had run to Sherman's Army. Which means that this image that we have of this moment has to be one that includes, wherever the Army went, large numbers of enslaved people quite literally paving the Army's way to Savannah, preparing the road for the Army to get there. Which again just speaks to how crucial they were. And this is something I should say again that the soldiers appreciated, they recognized, they knew this. They saw them as allies. They recognized just how important enslaved people were. And for many soldiers, this was an eye-opening experience. It made a real impression on them. And it told them that maybe ending slavery is what this war is about, and maybe enslaved people deserve a place in whatever America comes next, comes after the Civil War. So many of Sherman's soldiers, again, folks who had maybe never seen slavery before, many of them were actually first or second generation German immigrants who still spoke German, still wrote German. And this was just such an important experience for them, and for many, they left being really moved by it. But not everyone. For every soldier who had this experience and was moved by it, there were countless others who did not, and who went in the opposite direction, if anything. And here it's important for me to talk about what is undeniably the darkest, the bleakest, the most tragic episode in this entire story, and that is the terrible tragedy that takes place at Ebenezer Creek. And that tragedy happens for one man and one man only. And that is a man named Jefferson Columbus Davis, Jeff C. Davis. And I want to be very clear, this is not Jefferson F. Davis, the Confederate president. Two totally different people. They just happen to share a name. And Davis, I should say, is someone who everyone knew was a villain. They knew he was a rogue. He had a bad reputation. And he had a bad reputation because in 1862, he actually murdered a fellow U.S. Army general in cold blood. The guy's name was Henry Bull Nelson, and his nickname fits. He looked just like a bull. And Nelson was his superior. They were both serving in Louisville, Kentucky. Davis, by the way, is just across the river from Louisville in southern Indiana. That's where he's from. They were both in Louisville, and they both got into a disagreement, let's say. This disagreement, gets out of hand. And at one point, Nelson, he takes a piece of paper, he flicks it in Davis's face, and he says, "Go away, you damned puppy." Which was an insult that was enough for Davis to walk away, start walking the streets of Louisville. He borrows a gun from a friend, he walks back into Nelson's office, and before Nelson can stand up from his desk, shoots him dead. But fortunately for Davis, this is in the middle of the Civil War. And what did the U.S. Army need more than anything? Well, they needed experienced soldiers. So Davis never goes to trial, never sees any punishment. He's allowed to just go back into the Army and continue working his way up the ranks. And so he joins Sherman's army in Atlanta. He performs, well enough. And along the march to the sea, it's Davis who has the furthest left route. So when the army left Atlanta, the army was divided into two wings. They left in a right wing, but both wings had two different columns. So there were effectively 4 columns and then 1 column of cavalry. And so Davis's route was the farthest left, which meant his route took him closest to the Savannah River and all of the many waterways that branch off of it. And this is really important to remember. Davis, as I said, is someone from southern Indiana. He's known to be a pro-slavery Democrat. He's someone known to harbor these views. And sure enough, he is the only one of Sherman's main subordinates to write back, expressing real displeasure at the fact that so many refugees are following him. Does not like it, can't stand it. He asked Sherman for guidance about what to do. And to our knowledge, Sherman never actually responds. But it doesn't matter because Davis decides to take matters into his own hands. And his calling card, what becomes his method of dealing with this problem, is to essentially begin pulling up the Army's temporary bridges that they lay out across these waterways before the refugees get a chance to cross. This is an image that I think he's crossing the James River in Virginia, but it's an example of the kind of temporary pontoon bridges the Army would construct. And we know Davis does this once at a place called Buckhead Creek, which is kind of near Milledgeville. He does it probably another time, maybe another time after that, and then disaster strikes at Ebenezer Creek. And I should just say, and you all know this living in the Low Country, Ebenezer Creek's a little more than a creek. It's a classic Low Country waterway. It's a bayou or an arm of the Savannah River. Nowadays, it's actually a cypress swamp. It's a pretty thick black water swamp. And the crossing was actually close to the Savannah River, so the current would have been really strong. And this would have been in December 9th or 10th, if memory serves me correctly. So the water level would have been higher. And disaster strikes here because as soon as the Army gets across, bridges go up. And it just so happens that a large number of Confederate cavalry barrel in to the refugees who were stranded on the bank. And I say it just so happens, but they knew that the Confederate cavalry was around. And as soon as the bridges go up, the cavalry barrels into the refugees. Many go into the water, only some of whom make it to the other side. Many others are either killed in the water, shot in the water, or drowned. Those that are left stranded on the bank are either captured and re-enslaved or killed right on spot, right on site. And there are some harrowing stories of soldiers writing about the image they see of wet, damp people pulling themselves out of the river, fully aware that they've lost family members, that groups or units that have been traveling together for days now suddenly are missing several people. And there are even more harrowing stories of soldiers writing about seeing these refugees in whatever clothes they have, setting fires on the other side of the bank just to warm themselves. I mean, you all know, it doesn't get that cold in the winter here, but it's cold enough in December, right? Especially after you've been in the water. But this becomes a major turning point for a number of reasons. For Sherman's men, this is just another example of the extraordinary lengths enslaved people will go to pursue freedom, to follow the army. And it's just another reason to see them as allies and to see them as people worthy of a place in whatever America emerges from the Civil War. For the refugees, it's a turning point. You just can't go backwards now. To turn back means to try to cross the river, maybe run directly into Confederate cavalry. But it also becomes a turning point because after Sherman's army moves into Savannah, after Savannah falls, there is a brief investigation. Certainly the image of Sherman as someone who turned his back on free people does not match the image of Sherman as the conquering hero. But nonetheless, word has gotten back to Washington, D.C. about what happened at Ebenezer Creek. And it leads the Secretary of War, a man named Edwin Stanton, to come to Savannah and to launch a brief inquiry. Stanton's main purpose is, so he says, is to requisition all the cotton that's left in the city. But pretty soon he starts asking Sherman questions about what happened at Ebenezer Creek. At one point he pulls out a newspaper and he demands answers. And Sherman's plays him off. But he later insists that Sherman call a meeting at what becomes Sherman's headquarters, the beautiful green Meldrum House on Madison Square in Savannah, for folks that have been. And he tells Sherman to call a meeting with 20 of Savannah's leading black ministers. And the meeting they have goes on to be one of the most amazing in all the Civil War. It's sometimes known as the Savannah Colloquy. And one of the things that makes it so amazing is that several of the ministers were actually people who, despite being ministers, in some cases lay ministers, were enslaved right up until the moment that Sherman walked into the city. And here they are sitting down with two of the most powerful men in the country. The 20 ministers, they appoint a man named Garrison Frazier to serve as their spokesman. He speaks on their behalf. And Frazier himself is someone who had purchased his freedom 10 years before, as well as his wife's freedom 10 years before. And this meeting becomes such an amazing moment because Stanton is a nationally known, very well-respected, very wealthy railroad attorney. He's a born bureaucrat and administrator. And despite the fact that the subject of the meeting is what to do with the Georgia freedmen, meaning all of these refugees that has followed the army to the coast, he begins peppering Frazier with questions. Questions like, what is slavery? To which Frazier responds in the most succinct, eloquent manner someone of his station and condition could give. Stanton begins asking, well, what is freedom? And Frazier answers him as clearly and as eloquently as anyone could wish. And so this meeting becomes a much bigger meeting, or something much bigger than just what to do about the refugees. It's about, well, what does the war mean? What does slavery mean? What does it mean to end it? What does freedom mean? And Frazier is going tit for tat with Sherman and Stanton, these two extraordinarily powerful men. And what Frazier's ultimate vision is rooted in land. He tells Sherman and Stanton, he said the best thing that free people can have going into freedom is access to land. They want to be placed on land, to be able to purchase it, to give them independence going forward. And so this is why, a few days later, Sherman issues his famous Special Field Orders number 15, which sets aside a strip of requisitioned plantations from Charleston in the north to Jacksonville in the south for exclusively black homesteading. He's going to set aside land for formerly enslaved people. And I should say, Sherman is only self-interested in doing so. He's very clear that for him, this is simply a means of removing the refugees from his lines. He knows that he's about to march through South Carolina, and he doesn't want the refugees to follow him, so it's best for them to stay here on the coast. He knows that when he marches through South Carolina, he may encounter more free people, and rather than having them follow his army, he wants to say, go to the coast, find help. Don't follow me. And Sherman's very clear about this. He writes very clearly that it's all about his own personal strategic self-interest, or I should say it's the interest of his army. But it also doesn't matter. Now Sherman's someone who's never really known for thinking about politics, But the reality is that in giving this order, despite the fact that he didn't see it as a kind of transformative revolutionary measure, that's exactly what it becomes. Because for the first time ever, suddenly land reform is on the table for Reconstruction. People start talking about it in Washington, D.C., so he's effectively let the genie out of the bottle. And when he issues his special field orders, to date, that was the most transformative potential piece of Reconstruction policy that the government had issued. And so he lets the genie out of the bottle. And despite not intending to do so, he suddenly gives Reconstruction a new purview. Now Reconstruction can be much wider, much more important, much more influential, much more far-reaching than anyone at that moment could have imagined. So Sherman, he doesn't intend this to happen, but it doesn't matter. The genie's out. Toothpaste is out of the tube. Now, I want to end, though, by just going back to this really important meeting in the Green Melbourne House. Because there's a moment, and it's a brief moment, it's a small moment. We only have the transcript. But it's one of those moments when you find it, you sort of get tingly a little bit because it's powerful. And this moment happens because Stanton, again, a nationally known railroad attorney, who is in effect deposing Fraser. At one point he looks at him and he says, "How have you come by your opinions?" And what he's doing is he's trying to feel Fraser out. He's trying to figure out how, what gives you the authority to speak on behalf of so many people, right? What gives you the power to speak for everyone else? Why do you say these things? And Fraser looks back at it and he says, "Well, I've come by my opinions in the course of my ministry," because he's a pastor, "and in my conversations with the many freedmen who have followed Sherman's army here to Savannah, whose numbers surpass even my own expectation." And not only is this an amazing admission from Fraser that this movement is far larger than even he could have imagined, but it suggests that despite not physically being in the room that evening, the refugees nonetheless found a way to have their voices heard. They found a way to have a presence in that room. People who have been forgotten by history, who have been faceless and nameless to history, nonetheless, through extraordinary courage, suffering enormous hardship, found a way to run to the army, get to the Savannah, to talk to Fraser, to share their political ambitions, who then shared them with Sherman and Stanton, who then enacted them into a transformative piece of Reconstruction policy. And that's something that's pretty powerful. And so fundamentally, what this story is a story about people, again, who history have forgotten, who nonetheless found a way to do something very extraordinary, to go on and change history nonetheless. Like I said, that's a history that I try to tell. And it's one that I've been very privileged to tell to audiences like you all. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm happy to field questions if anyone has any. We'll go here and there. Here.
Me first?
Sure.
Where do you get your source material?
Yeah, so the question is about source material. And it's a great question because, well, I think for obvious reasons, right? Enslaved people they leave behind few sources. Unfortunately, there were two source collections, shall we say, that proved to be really important, really useful for me. And the first is simply military records, right? The reality, and some of you veterans in the audience maybe might know this, is that armies are nothing if not giant bureaucracies. They leave behind reams and reams of paperwork, reports, letters, and enslaved people appear in these reports. They don't always appear in any sort of qualitative fashion, meaning we don't always get great stories, but they appear in abundance. And so just through sheer preponderance of evidence, you can begin to sort of take all these different stories, all these different references, allusions, right, mentions, and just in totality, begin to tell a much larger story. So that's one source base, I suppose we can say. The other is the soldiers themselves. Sherman's men knew that they were taking part in one of the great campaigns of American history. They like to write about Sherman as if he was Napoleon, which should tell you a little bit about how they saw themselves, I suppose. And they were more than willing to write about their experiences, to share their experiences, and to write them down. They were especially eager to do this when they found out that publishers were willing to pay them for their experiences. And again, these are folks from the Midwest. Many of them are first, second generation immigrants. They never really seen slavery, interacted with enslaved people, and their interactions with them is one of the things that makes this campaign so unique. So they write about it at length. And again, sometimes you don't get great stories. These are certainly people that have their own prejudices and biases. But again, just through the sheer preponderance of evidence, you can use them to try to tell a much larger story. And so that's what I've tried to do.
So, in the timeline of Sherman's march and the timeline of the war itself, what prompted Sherman to burn Atlanta and save Savannah?
That's a great question. So, essentially, why was Atlanta burned and Savannah not? And if you were to ask Sherman, he would say that he didn't intend on burning Atlanta. He gave instructions to actually burn all of its munitions factories. Atlanta was a kind of industrial hub in the 19th century, in the U.S. It was really the South's last remaining hub. So part of the strategy was to burn every munitions factory, every railroad yard, anything that could support the war effort. But as fires do, they tend to spread. And as drunken soldiers tend to do, they tend to help it spread sometimes. And that is in part the story of Atlanta. Of course, there's lots of anecdotal stories that basically says that Sherman could have put it out, but he basically chose not to. So that's what happens in Atlanta. And the reason that Savannah doesn't meet the same fate is in part because Savannans know exactly what happened in Atlanta. And when the army gets there, they essentially give Sherman a key to the city. The Green Meldrum House is given to him by one of its leading residents. The mayor comes out to meet him. They don't want the same thing to happen to Savannah. They also know that the war is over. They're very aware of this. And again, Savannah, this was Georgia's biggest city, its biggest economic engine. And what it relied on was the cotton trade, but especially the river. And since the war began, the river had been blocked. And so by the time the army gets there, they know the war's over. They're ready just to let bygones be bygones, open up the river, let's start making money again. And so they're happy to welcome the army into Savannah.
Could you comment on how important it was to Lincoln in taking Savannah?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And ironically not enough. Lincoln doesn't really have a whole lot to do with it. It's really Sherman. One of the things that Lincoln learns very early on is he doesn't have a whole lot of military experience. He had previously served as a foot soldier in the Black Hawk War in northern Illinois in the 1830s, but that's really it. And early on in the war, he gets bitten a few times by trying to intervene. And so one of the things that he appreciates about Sherman and Grant is that they basically know what they're doing, and that he can be hands-off, that he's going to let them manage the war themselves. And in fact, there's a great story. I mean, in Sherman leaving Atlanta, he has to leave his supply lines, but he also has to leave all of his communication lines. And so newspapers, for this month and a half, they call it Sherman's Lost Armies. They don't know where it's at. And even Lincoln. In fact, there's a great story of Sherman's brother, who's a U.S. senator. He's all been out of shape, trying to figure out where, what's the status of his brother? Is he alive? Is he okay? Where are they in Georgia? And he goes to Lincoln in the White House and he asks him, do you have any information? And Lincoln basically just says no. And he says, quote, we know what hole he went into, we just don't know what hole he's going to come out of. So Lincoln has a kind of hands-off approach here. He doesn't really know what's going on. He's not really a military strategist. But Savannah is taken before Christmas. Famously, it's offered as a gift to Lincoln as a Christmas gift. But the moment that matters more to him is Atlanta. Because Atlanta falls in September of 1864, which is 2 months before the election of 1864 in November, an election that Lincoln's not sure he's going to win. And he wins in part because Atlanta falls, tells everyone the war's almost over, and tells everyone that we need to vote for Lincoln so we can finish this war now that it's almost done. And so Atlanta is hugely important for the politics of the war. Yeah.
So I think I read, tell me if this is correct, Sherman wired Washington and said, you gotta send people down here to get these blacks off my back. I can't have this mass of humanity following me. They're slowing me down. So if that's true, when did that happen and how does that fit in with this conference at that house?
Sure. So he begins to talk to the U.S. government after Fort McAllister falls. which is just before Savannah, because Fort McAllister's on the Ogeechee River, which connects them to the U.S. Navy, which connects them back to Washington, D.C. And the reason this meeting happens is because the U.S. government wants to figure out a solution. Sherman was always a military guy. He didn't think about politics. He didn't think about grand strategy. There's a great story where Stanton tells him, like, you need to think long term. You need to think about post-war politics. And he says, no. He says, once I'm done, I'm going to out west. I'm going to Colorado, taking my hunting rifle, and you're not going to hear from me ever again. It's not true. But that's an example of sort of how Sherman just wasn't thinking about politics. And so the U.S. government steps in. That's why Stanton comes to Savannah to try to find some form of humane, workable solution for dealing with so many people who many folks believe the U.S. Army owed and had an obligation to help because of how useful and how crucial they were to, again, the success of the Army.
Was Sherman's directive of 40 acres and a mule upended by President Johnson's restoration of property to the rightful owners in his view?
Yeah, so the question is what happens to the Sherman's orders, and that's exactly right. It's upended by Andrew Johnson, which is a really tragic turn in this story. Happens after the war. Well, happens after the war is over, and it has a lot to do with just who Johnson is. Johnson becomes Lincoln's vice president in 1864. He was not Lincoln's first choice in 1860, but Johnson becomes a hero in the U.S. Because Johnson is from East Tennessee. He's a senator from Tennessee, and he's the only Southern senator not to secede with the rest of his colleagues when the Civil War begins. So he's hailed as the one Southern politician who, stands up for the country, that remains in the Union. Because of this, Lincoln awards him with a plum position being the military governor of Tennessee. And when Lincoln thinks he might lose the election in 1864, he sort of pushes his current vice president aside, and he chooses Johnson because he thinks Johnson might make him appear as a kind of unity candidate of North and South. Johnson, the one Southern senator, Lincoln joining hands, despite the fact that they shared very little politically. They had two very different visions. Johnson was kind of a Democrat, Lincoln was a Republican. And this comes back to bite the country when Lincoln is killed. Because Johnson is elevated to the vice presidency. And he's someone who, where Lincoln was beginning to develop a much more expansive view of what Reconstruction should look like, Johnson had a much more limited view. His saying was the country as it was, the Constitution as it is, which was his way of saying just recreate the status quo. But you can't do that. It's a massive war, killed maybe 1 million people, it just happened. 4 million enslaved people are now free, the country's being changed as never before. But this was Johnson's approach. And he's given extraordinary power to basically begin enacting Reconstruction, which includes the restoration of land and other property, because of a weird quirk of history, which is that in this really crucial period of American history, right after the Civil War, after Lincoln is killed, Congress actually isn't in session. Congress goes out of session in March of 1865 and doesn't come back into session until December of 1865. Which basically means that Johnson has extraordinary power to begin shaping policy. Now, when Congress does come back, they do begin to step in and begin passing legislation to pursue Reconstruction, the really important Civil Rights Law. There's a renewal of the Freedmen's Bureau Bill. There's a number of things that Congress begins doing. But Johnson vetoes them. Vetoes both. He vetoes almost everything because he has this limited view of Reconstruction. And so what this means is that Congress doesn't actually sort of take the reins back of Reconstruction until about the summer of 1866, which by then is far too late. And so this coincident history goes on to have real consequences for what the war, at the end of the war, looks like. Yeah.
I just thought about this. So, could you talk to me about the pathway from emancipation to formally enslaved people to becoming U.S. citizens?
Sure. It happens in the course of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is passed in 1867. It is the second of what is known as the three Reconstruction Acts. And these are three changes to the U.S. Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, that revolutionize basically the way our government works and the way our Constitution is written. 13th abolishes slavery forever. The 14th is what is remembered as the Citizenship Act, but it does a whole lot more than that. And the 15th is remembered as the Voting Rights Act, but it is not quite that, because what the 15th says is that voting cannot be curtailed based on race, ethnicity, or previous condition of servitude. It is not an explicit, everyone has the right to vote, which will matter about a generation later. But citizenship comes in the 14th Amendment, which again is passed in 1867, and this is meant to be the piece of legislation that is going to transform the country. It's going to include free people, it's going to include more people, it's going to give citizenship rights to women in many respects. And this is really the bill that encompasses the sort of spirit of freedom that comes out of the Civil War in sort of the same sense that, these sort of revolutionary era bills and change, or the writing of the Constitution, right, comes out of the same generation. It's part of the same sort of spirit of freedom that emerges after the Civil War. Citizenship is part of that. It is part of the 14th Amendment. There's a whole host of other different prescriptions that are in the 14th Amendment as well. And interestingly enough, that's actually how suffrage is included, because one of the things that the U.S. government does is tell southern states that if you don't adopt the 14th Amendment, and if you don't write universal suffrage laws into your state constitutions, we will take away your representation in Congress. So the 14th Amendment not only describes citizenship, it enforces voting rights, and it also defines citizenship for the first time. It does so through birthright citizenship, which says that anyone born in the U.S. Has citizenship, except, want to take a guess what the exception is? Native Americans. It's the one exception to this clause. And birthright citizenship is crafted in a way to be as encompassing as possible, to make sure that free people, you name it, whoever it is, will have their rights protected. So there's a real reason they choose birthright citizenship as the marker and definition for what citizenship looks like.
Let's thank Dr. Parten for a great talk tonight.